Hey class! Now that we've kind of learned about the anatomy of the respiratory system, let's learn about the physiology or how it functions, the job that it's supposed to perform based on its structure. So the functions of the respiratory system, again, is to supply the body with oxygen and to get rid of carbon dioxide. You can also add in there, based on the first slide, that it also helps maintain pH. So helps pH levels. And basically, it makes sure that your blood isn't too acidic or too basic. Now, the respiration includes 4 distinct events. So, respiration, I mean breathing. So, you have pulmonary ventilation is the first step. The second step is external respiration. We have respiratory gas transport, and then internal respiration. So if I was going to talk about these 4 events of respiration, let's first look at a brief description of each. Pulmonary ventilation is moving air into and out of the lungs, and this is commonly called breathing. Breathe in to bring air in, breathe out to take out air out of your lungs. The second thing is external respiration. This is where gas exchange occurs between your pulmonary blood, so pulmonary meaning lungs, and your alveoli within your lungs. Oxygen is typically loaded into the blood to be carried to the rest of the body, whereas carbon dioxide is unloaded to be breathed out into the atmosphere. Now, this is called external respiration, and one way that you can remember that is because gas exchange is being made between the blood and the exterior air, the outside air. So that's one way to help you remember external respiration in the lungs, pulmonary blood and alveoli. The third thing is, once you pick up oxygen and you put it into the blood, you have to be able to transport that. So oxygen and carbon dioxide is transferred to and from the lungs and the tissue cells through the bloodstream. And remember, your bloodstream it works hand in hand with your cardiovascular system. And the last step is internal respiration. Once you get that oxygen in the blood where it needs to go, we have to exchange it between the blood. And I'm going to say blood from your systemic capillary, systemic meaning the body, and the tissue cells that need the oxygen. So tissue cells can be things like your leg muscles or anywhere inside the body. First, we're going to talk about pulmonary ventilation a little bit more detail. Remember, this is known as breathing. So this is a mechanical process, and it depends on volume within your thoracic cavity. One thing to understand about volume is volume and pressure are related. This is something that we've mentioned in integrated science, both Mr. B and I, depending on who you had. And we know that volume and pressure are related based on Boyle's law. Now, volume changes lead to pressure changes. And when there are pressure changes, gas is going to flow in order to equalize those pressures and make them basically the same. So substances always flow from high to low pressure. I'm going to go ahead and star that big area. Another thing to understand about Boyle's law and pressure is pressure and volume are inversely related. This means as one increases, the other decreases, and vice versa. Now, there are 2 phases that go along with pulmonary ventilation. You have inspiration, which is inhaling, bringing air into your lungs. And then you have expiration, which is where you exhale and breathe out and air leaves your lungs. Okay. So let's first delve deep into inspiration, or when you inhale. When you inhale, your diaphragm, which is located below your lungs, and your external intercostal muscles, so those right where your ribs are at, they contract. When they contract, they cause the volume inside your lungs, so intrapleural pulmonary. So intra is inside, pulmonary is lungs. So again, they cause that volume in your lungs to increase. The reason it increases is because the rib cage is lifted, the sternum goes forward, and that diaphragm kind of flattens out. Now remember what I said, volume and pressure are inversely proportional. So if volume increases, pressure decreases. This creates a vacuum effect, and remember, everything always wants to go from high to low. So if it's high pressure outside and low pressure inside, it pulls air into the lungs. So air flows into the lungs until this pressure is equalized or equal with your atmospheric pressure. Here we have a picture of inspiration. When you breathe in, your diaphragm kind of flattens out. You can kind of see your rib cage just to be a little bit bigger. Ribs are elevated. Here, if you're wondering where your external intercostal muscles are located, they're located here within your rib cage to help pull it up. And air is going to flow in. Here's one that kind of shows the pressure during inspiration. When you breathe in, notice that the pressure in your lungs actually decreases. The next one we're going to talk about is expiration or exhalation. When you exhale, breathe out. This is a largely passive process. You just do it naturally. You don't have to exert a lot of energy in order to do it. And it actually depends on your lungs' elasticity. So how can it stretch and then recoil back to where it was? One thing to know about expiration is it honestly is the opposite of inspiration. So instead of the volume increasing, volume is going to decrease when you relax those muscles. This causes gas pressure to increase. Remember, it always wants to go high to low. So since you have high pressure in your lungs now, it's going to actually push the air out to the atmosphere. And again, it does that until it equalizes those pressures. Now, I said this is a passive process. It doesn't require a lot of energy. You can still force yourself to breathe out. And in order to do that, you have to actually contract your internal intercostal muscles to make your rib cage kind of like make the volume even smaller. So breathe out even more. You go. So here you can kind of see it's kind of stretched. Your rib cage is not near as big as here, where it's kind of pulled out. The next thing in order to talk about the mechanics of breathing is intrapleural pressure. Now, this is not the same as intrapulmonary pressure. Not the same thing. Remember, intrapulmonary pressure was pressure inside the lungs. Intrapleural pressure is pressure inside that little pleural space or that cavity between the lining of the lungs. We said that that's very important to maintain because it helps keep our pressure always being negative. We want it always negative. If it's not and it gets punctured, there's a hole in it, air gets into that space, we are going to run into the situation where our lungs could collapse, and we don't want that. So if intrapleural pressure equals atmospheric pressure, lungs are going to collapse on itself and you're going to be sent to the hospital. So here I brought this picture back up. Again, when you inhale, pressure decreases. When you exhale, pressure increases. Here is your volume of breath. When you inhale, the volume, you bring in more air. When you exhale, you release that amount of air. Now that we understand breathing, let's delve into, okay, once you breathe, you have external respiration, gas transport, and internal respiration. Hopefully, you remember from the last lesson, gas exchange occurs because of diffusion. So things diffuse in and out of cells, or they basically cross the membrane. For external respiration, this is where gases are going to be exchanged between, again, your alveoli and your pulmonary blood. This is also known as pulmonary gas exchange. Hopefully, you remember a few slides back, We said external because this is your lungs is where you meet that external air, the air outside your body. Internal respiration, again, is exchange occurring between blood and tissue cells. And this is called systemic capillary gas exchange because it happens at the body. So body, lungs, and the important part here is alveoli. And the important thing here is blood and tissue cells. Just like pressure, movement of gas is always going to go to an area of lower concentration. It's always going to go from high to low. If you look at this picture, it is a very good example of pressures within lungs. If you look up here where we have alveoli capillaries, this is again in your lungs. So I'm going to say lungs up here. We're going to see that in our lungs, our oxygen is very, very high and our CO2 is very, very low. As you go down, it carries that oxygen through the heart where it's going to be pumped to the rest of the body. When you get here, you have high oxygen, low CO2. But you see down here, it is going to be in your tissue cells. Oh, let me kind of hide this. In your tissue cells, it has low oxygen. So remember, it always goes from high to low. So oxygen is going to leave the blood and go into the cells. CO2 is going to leave the cells and go into the blood. And now you're going to notice, hey, I have low oxygen, high CO2 that gets carried back to the lungs where you're going to bring in high oxygen. So it always goes from high to low, and this causes O2 to enter back in. Okay. So oxygen, for external respiration, oxygen is put into the blood. Oxygen causes the blood to become oxygen rich. So oxygen diffuses from the oxygen-rich air to the alveoli to the oxygen-poor blood. From there, it is going to also unload carbon dioxide and cause it to diffuse out of the blood into the alveoli to be released out into the air. So here, this is where we see our loading and unloading of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Wait, this is the wrong picture. Scratch that. Here is where we're going to see the loading and unloading of carbon dioxide with your alveoli, and here you have your plasma membrane. So CO2 goes into your air sacs, O2 leaves. Okay, sorry about that. Then we have to transport that gas. Oxygen transport in the blood is transported in the blood two ways. One way that oxygen is transported, and the way you most likely remember from any kind of health class, is it attaches to something called hemoglobin inside red blood cells. Now, hemoglobin, in the middle of it, there is iron. So when they tell you your iron levels, it's basically telling you how much iron do you have for oxygen to bind to transport it around your body. So if you have low iron, usually you're anemic and you don't get oxygen around your body as well. Now, when oxygen attaches to the hemoglobin on red blood cells, it forms something called oxyhemoglobin. There is also oxygen transported in a very small amount carried in plasma as well. Now, plasma is just the liquid, basically, matrix that your blood cells float in. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is transported in the blood a little bit differently. Instead of a lot of it attaching to red blood cells, most carbon dioxide is actually diffused into plasma because it is more soluble than blood. In plasma, it's carried, instead of carbon dioxide, it's carried as a bicarbonate ion by attaching to a hydrogen. Now, this ion plays an important role in buffering your blood's pH, which is why we mentioned that your respiratory system also maintains pH value. Now, a small amount is carried on red blood cells, but thankfully they bind to different sites than oxygen, so we don't ever have to worry about not getting enough oxygen to our body. Your book does mention, and I'm going to talk about it right now, carbon monoxide is the deadly killer. Carbon monoxide actually binds to the same sites as oxygen, which is why if you breathe in carbon monoxide, it actually binds to the hemoglobin more readily than oxygen. And so oxygen can't bind, it doesn't have a spot, and therefore it doesn't get to the rest of your body for your cells to use. And you basically die because your cells start to die from lack of oxygen. Now, for carbon dioxide to get out of the blood and into the alveoli, it has to be released from this bicarbonate form that it actually travels as. So what happens is this bicarbonate ion enters red blood cells, combines with hydrogen to make carbonic acid, and this carbonic acid then breaks down into water and CO2, where that CO2 now can diffuse out of the blood and leave and go into the lungs. The last thing that we have to talk about is internal respiration. Again, this is going to be between blood and tissue cells. It's the opposite of what happens in the lungs. Instead of carbon dioxide getting unloaded, it is now loaded and put into the blood. Oxygen is going to be unloaded and taken out of the blood and put into those tissues. So here I mixed up those pictures, so I'm going to kind of show it up here. O2 goes into the tissues, CO2 goes into the bloodstream. So that's the end of today's lesson. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be more than happy to help. And I hope you guys have a great day.